Hello there, BookTube. My name is Daniel. Welcome back to my channel, Guilty Feet. I've got no rhythm. Today I'm going to do my Friday reads. I finished one major book and some comic books this week, and I wanted to just give a build-up to the big book that I finished by taking through all the other books that I've read by this author. It's George Saunders. So the book we're going to talk about, which I finished reading, took me about a week and a half, so I didn't really do a Friday reads last week. We're going to get to I can never remember the title, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading and life by George Saunders. Not my first time round with Saunders, as I want to show you. I read Saunders famous for his short stories, starting with Civil War Land in Bad Decline. And very early on, you get the sense that Saunders has a sensibility that is different from anybody else's. Follow that up with Pastoralia, another set of short stories. And suddenly we find that we're dealing with somebody writing short stories, not as a lead up to a novel, not as a follow-up to a novel and trying to get something else out there, but actually somebody who cares about the form and is writing short stories. And I urge you to go back. These are well worth revisiting. Often you find that when an author becomes famous, his earlier short stories are not worth visiting. This is where Saunders is formed, and he begins his career, in my eyes at least, fully formed as an absolutely outstanding short story writer. Different in many ways. He's been responsible for a whole bunch of other short story writing in the decades since he launched his career. But every word of Saunders' stories are indisputably George Saunders, and he makes his mark very early on in his writing career, and you'll get the hang of it very quickly. After that, I read this, which I bought and read to my kids. This is a book that he put out called The Very Persistent Gappers of Fripp, illustrated by Lane Smith. It is essentially a children's fable with these absolutely gorgeous drawings all the way through. So it's not a graphic novel. Let me show you. It's text, but with astonishing pictures about some weird creatures that come, and gappers will get your goat if you don't brush them off and return them to the ocean, whence they arrive every day. And that's what happens. The gappers come to try and take away the goats, and there's a whole series of things that happen to the goats and how they try and protect the goats from the gappers on the island of Fripp. An odd little thing. That's a gapper, I think. Odd little thing I read to my kids. We all had a good laugh with it, but it's just a beautiful book. This was put out by Bloomsbury in the UK. Then I've got some more short stories. I think this is 2 collections together. This is The Brief and Frightening Reign of Phil, that includes In Persuasion Nation, which was some other stuff, also great. And then I've got The Brain Dead Megaphone, which was essays, non-fiction essays, first lot of non-fiction that I read. These were also great. I think there's one just the titles, if I read to you some of the titles of these things. The Brain Dead Megaphone, Mr. Vonnegut in Sumatra, A Brief Study of the British, The Perfect Gerbil, reading, just odd little, and some literary stuff in here, but I sort of read this because I was reading George Saunders, and this was the next one that came along. And then this was going to be his big breakthrough, but it was another short story collection. So this was the point where the world said, okay, George Saunders does short stories. We love George Saunders. We don't know how to promote short stories. The companies don't know how to promote short stories. This is also put out by Bloomsbury in the UK. And 10th of December was lauded everywhere, reviewed everywhere, unusually for a short story collection. And George Saunders was taken seriously as a short story writer. This is blurbed on the front by Zadie Smith and Jonathan Franzen in the UK edition. On the back, John McGregor, Harry Kunzru, Margaret Atwood, and Thomas Pynchon. So I think that's me, 1, 2. Yeah, full blurb bingo. I've read something by each of the named blurbists. And this was a terrific collection. I actually thought this was not as good as some of his early collections, and I was a bit tired of it at this point. I thought it was more of the same. This didn't blow me away. Like, this was, I think, a lot of people's first introduction to Saunders. Very well received. I think was up for a bunch of awards, because people decided, listen, we have to take notice of George Saunders. He's an important figure. He's working in this short story format we don't really know what to do with, but we're going to take it seriously, and this was the book that did it. But to confound everyone still further, after he put out the 10th of December, George Saunders' next book was even better received, and that was, of course, Lincoln the Bardo, his first novel. Lauded finally, after all these short stories, some non-fiction, George Saunders put out a novel. Is it a novel? So who we got blurred here? Jonathan Franzen again, Sadie Smith, and maybe from the early one, Khaled Hosseini, Thomas Pynchon, Jennifer Egan, and Dave Eggers. Also, bingo, I read all of these. I read something by each of those. Barely a novel. I don't think it's a novel. I think it's an absolute masterpiece, but it's a screenplay for an unfilmable movie. You can see everything is there's no description. There's just dialogue and the name of the person who's speaking, and there's 100 odd named characters. It's a weird and wonderful and oddly moving story of Abraham Lincoln's son who gets ill in the Bardo and dies, and the Bardo is a place in between life and death, where his spirit waits to pass over, and while he's there, the spirit of Lincoln child meets up with all sorts of weird and wonderful ghosts and just I mean, I don't think I've done it justice. I don't think it's possible to describe Lincoln in the Bardo. It is an overwhelming experience, and it is, novel sized as opposed to all the short stories that's written up till now. And for me, it worked. I don't think it's necessarily a novel, but it worked as a reading experience that I read from cover to cover. The audiobook for those, or the audio version for those interested, has got a full cast of Hollywood celebrities, and again, sort of like 100 speaking voices, and all, a who's who of hip Hollywood TV and film stars. But this, for me, was terrific. Lincoln in the Bardo. That was the last release we heard of George Saunders before putting out earlier this year this work of non-fiction essays based on lectures and a course he has given as a teacher in Russian literature and Russian short stories. We've got blurb on the back. Let's go through these. See if there are any names we haven't heard yet. Zadie Smith, Khaled Hosseini, Max Porter, new one, Colson Whitehead, Jennifer Egan, Margaret Atwood, Harry Kunzru. Another bingo. It seems I'm in tune with at least the people who are blurbing Saunders books, because I read something by all of them. So there are 7 short stories discussed in here by 4 different authors. We have Chekhov, Tolstoy, Turgenev, and a story by Gogol, which I think out of all 7 stories, there's only one of them that I'd actually read before. And I've read a fair bit of Tolstoy. I've read a couple of Turgenev novels. I've read one collection of Chekhov, and one of the stories in here was from the collection I read, but it was a different translation, so I actually put them side to side, and it was very different. And he discussed that. So to be clear what's going on, so seven chapters, each one is a breakdown of a particular short story, and the short stories are reproduced here in full. One thing that he makes very clear is that he's working with particular translations. George Saunders does not speak Russian. He's not a Russian scholar. So when he's looking at these stories, he's looking at them in terms of a plot, in terms of point of view, in terms of everything except the specific language. And he understands that he may be missing nuance and jokes and puns in the original Russian, which are very hard to translate. And there's, occasionally he'll look at 2 or 3 different translations of the same line just to compare and see what's going on. But for the most part, he acknowledges that he is hamstrung by his inability to speak and read in Russian, and so he's reviewing the stories, and that's put there up front and becomes a non-issue, I think, as when you get into the meat of it, because it's not about that. It's not about specific word choice of an author, but it is about sentence choice. It is about framing. It is about the way a digression in the middle of a short story that takes you in a different direction. And was that necessary? And he constantly asking the question, and as someone who is, I think, acknowledged a masterful short story writer himself, he's legitimately asking the question, why is this here? Why did the author decide to do that? Why is this person described like this, or not described at all? Why do we see inside the mind of this person, and we see his last thoughts before dying, but when this person dies, we don't get anything inside the mind? And he just it really gets under the skin of short stories in a way that I'm not sure that I'm necessarily there for. I don't read works of literary criticism. I studied literature at university. I wasn't very good at it. A lot of it goes over my head. I think the last work of literary criticism I read was Ian Forster's Aspects of the Novel, which went right over my head. And I was kind of prepared for this to be a bit highbrow and too clever for me, because I'm much more of an impressionistic reader. I get to the end and I've liked it or I haven't liked it, and I don't really examine my feelings too much. I love reading, so when I read something, I want to read something else. But I'm less keen to go back and say, well, how did they do this and what's happening there? And let me read it again and see if I understand it differently this time. I'm moving forward. So I was worried that I would get bogged down in this, but it's so wise and it's so human, and he's looking at these stories, which are all wonderful, each uniformly amazing stories. And there's one in particular which I think was the heart and the key point for him to go into this, and he talks about that. But all of them, each of the 7 stories was exactly as marvelous as you would expect, and I didn't get bogged down in any of it, in any of his the minutiae of understanding the sentence choice and the decisions and the plotting and the path that the sometimes meandering, sometimes straightforward, sometimes surreal. So the first short story is In the Cart by Anton Chekhov, which was a very simple character study about an unhappy woman making a journey home and the things that go through her head, and a man she sees and considers would she marry him. Just beautiful, a wonderful short story, very simple, and he goes page by page. So each page of the short story is followed by an explanation. That's the only time he does that. Later on, he reprints the story in full, and then we have the discussion afterwards. It's just, I can never do this justice, but I would highly recommend, if you have any interest at all in Saunders, in short story writing, in the Russians, I think this is going to be just a source of joy for you. And I say the story that I think the standout chapter in this book is for me, okay, I'll talk about the standout and then I'll talk about another one which I really loved. There's a short story called Gooseberries by Anton Chekhov, which is about 2 men out for a walk and just going back and forth and having a discussion, and they end up at the farm of a third friend, and they all stay up all night drinking and just talking to each other and chatting, and one of them decides he's going to tell a story, and he tells a long and convoluted story, and the others aren't that impressed by it, and then they all go to bed. And on the one hand, it seems like barely anything has happened, and yet there's something tremendous has happened, and I would have got to the end of the story and thought, well, yeah, without being able to examine what I had loved about it. And the fact that I then have 30-40 pages of Saunders explaining to me exactly what's happened, and challenging me to try and work it out myself and see this. And it's not, I'm not saying he's taking you to the right answer. Now we've unlocked it and this puzzle has been solved. No, he challenges the reader to look at things in different ways and ask questions and see what's going on. And is this a class thing? Is there a friend thing? Why these 2 friends are described differently, and what do we learn about their personalities from this? And then the response, and then and that in the story, Gooseberries is the part where they take a swim in a pond in the rain, which is where the title comes from. And then he brings it back at the end. He talks about Chekhov's worship of Tolstoy, who was a much older man at that point, and the great man of Russian literature, and Chekhov was a young upstart and terrified of meeting Tolstoy and disappointing him. And he tells the anecdote right at the end of Saunders' review or going over Gooseberries. He tells the story of Chekhov meeting Tolstoy for the first time, arriving at his estate, and as he's walking down the path towards the great house, Tolstoy is coming towards him in a robe with a towel over his shoulder, and rather than meeting by the fireplace and surrounded by books, they have their first conversation. They jump into the pond and are swimming around, and they have a conversation there. And 3 years after that, Chekhov writes Gooseberries, the story about the people having a swim in a pond in the rain. It's quite a beautiful, beautiful work that did not go over my head, brought me in and gave me a deeper understanding of the stories that I read. I'm not sure I'm going to go further and read much literary criticism, but if George Saunders was to take my hand and guide me through every single short story ever written, I think I would kind of be okay with that. if you're not interested in Russian Victorian literature, if you've got no love of Tolstoy, then perhaps this isn't for you. The other story I want to talk about here is called The Nose by Nicolai Gogol, which I wasn't familiar with at all. The only thing I know about Gogol, I was in a play of his once in school, The Government Inspector, which is, I think, was made into a film, The Inspector General, with Danny Kaye, but we were in an English translation of and I played the judge, Kropkin, I don't know what his name was, and very funny. And The Nose is this astonishing short story about a man who wakes up one morning and his nose is gone, and then he sees the nose dressed up and been promoted above him and going off to the opera. It's just a weird story that has no explanation. There's no internal logic to it at all. And Saunders, it said that you could read the whole story and just go, well, that was weird, I think funny and quirky. And Saunders explains every single bit, or points out the inconsistencies and explains why inconsistency is okay, and sometimes subverting the internal logic of a story might reveal more. In other ways, you've got a entirely linear and clear path. I'm rambling and babbling, and I don't think I'm doing it justice at all. But I bought this because I read George Saunders, and I was buying the next George Saunders. I was nervous about taking this on because it's 400 pages. It's got 7 Russian short stories, which I didn't know that I'd only read one of them before, but I would have known that I'd read it before. And yet every page of this was a joy. The stories themselves are marvelous, and then his explanations of them. One only wishes one could sit in one of his actual lectures and hear him talk about this, because he's so down to earth. He's so not in the drifting off in the realms of academia. He's absolutely talking to people who love reading. I think he started, the course was for writers and looking at short stories from a writer's perspective. But I think ultimately this is about looking at short stories also from a reader's perspective. And if you are a reader, and there's every chance that if you're watching this, you may well be, then I think you'll get a kick out of this. So, George Saunders, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life. After I finished that, so this is, I took this on because it's still in the middle of non-fiction November, or coming to the end of non-fiction November. After that, I just had a little palate cleanse, and I finished the last 2 volumes. I'd read the first one of X-Men, The End. The first one was Dreams and Demons, so I just refreshed that and read that again. And then I did the second volume, which was X-Men The End, Heroes and Martyrs, and X-Men The End, Men and X-Men. This is Chris Claremont coming back to X-Men and wrapping up some loose ends, a sort of Dark Knight Returns, a sort of final story of the X-Men, and it's X-Men's greatest hits, and people come in and go out, and big bads reappear. The big bad, I'm not going to spoil who the big bad is in this, but it's a lot of things going on. Some of it sort of unresolved, and some of it is build up, and then nothing happens to that, and we hit the beats again and again. Wolverine and Jean Grey, and then Scott, and Scott's bizarre love life with Jean Grey, and then Madeline Pryor, and then Emma Frost, and all these things are happening and play out in this giant intergalactic space saga. Maybe I'm a bit over it. Maybe I was, one time in my life I was very involved in the X-Men and Chris Claremont's version of the soap opera that was the life of Homo Superior. But maybe I'm a little over it. Anyway, I got it done, and I don't know when I'll go back to X-Men, even though I have, I think, a couple of volumes of different from a later stage, much more recent. And after that, back into non-fiction November, I'm now reading Marc Chagall's My Life, which was written in 1922. So this is before the war. This is he is. I think already established, maybe in Paris now, and he's writing about his childhood growing up in Russia, and his family and his uncles, and it is a rich family life, a rich Jewish life, and he's writing it as kind of stream of consciousness. This is not a linear memoir in any shape or form. It is an artist's impression in writing. and quite lovely. So I'm 60 pages in, but another 100 pages to go, and I'll do that. And then I think I might squeeze in at least one more non-fiction before the end of the month, maybe two. We'll see. But that is my Friday reads. Happy Thanksgiving if you had it, or celebrating Black Friday, or taking the whole weekend with family, if that's what you do. And if not, have a great weekend. Take care. Bye.